we know, also this fall he has this installation at the KINDL Brauerei, Olympia, and I think he also will specifically talk about that. So, you're welcome here. Thank you. Thank you.
I was speaking English, although I imagine I could try in German, but you might regret it, so let's stick to English. So Olympia, we call it Olympia, but the long title on the screen is the official title, because, well, it's just part of the thing. The stadium that turns into ruin over the course of 1,000 years, which is of course a metaphor for what happens when you confront ideological time, so the time of utopias or the time of ideas, with lived time or biological time, the time of being born, growing up, living, and ultimately passing away. And in fact, the whole project of Olympia, although it took many years to accomplish, which is usual in my studio, is rather simple as this dichotomy between biological time and utopian time. And I had the idea on a spring day in, I believe it must have been 2009 or 2010, when I regularly visited the Olympic Stadium. I think I visited first time in 2002, and ever since came back every couple of years. And so I got to know a little bit the stadium more intimately. Came there several. Oh, I thought that was alcohol. I'm very disappointed now. Okay. I don't know what that is. And then at one point, started to develop this idea to create a space which would be massively big, but really not only conceptually, but also in the way you experience it. And so we started working with the studio. We started having discussions on how we could approach this piece of software, if we could make it as a small artist studio, because this is the way I work is this is not Jeff Koons' studio. This is a maximum 10 people working together on one or two projects, and everybody does what they're best at. This is the way my studio works. It's usually young artists. So I discuss everything with them, and I get a lot back from them, and basically what we do is, one could say as a dictator, it may be my project, but it's really them who help realizing it as a studio. So then started this discussion and period of research also, if the project was feasible or not. Very quickly, it appeared to us that 1,000 years would not be possible. Everybody knows that, and I think you know it from reading the title of the work, that it's an impossibility. But that we might develop, in reality, a script for at least 25 to 50 years. And this is what it became. The work, everybody knows, will not last 1,000 years unless people in the future, an artist or a studio, or whoever, feels like picking up the thread and continuing to build on the disintegration of the stadium of Berlin. Which involves, as you may guess, a lot of research work, scientific, on plants, trees, materials, the effects of climate change, earthquakes, prolonged winters or very long rainy periods. And I might maybe start with giving you a little bit of an insight of how this research period looks like. So the work started to play in March 2016 is when it came to life. I would say pretty much like the monster of Frankenstein. It came to life with a lot of problems. It didn't breathe very well, it didn't live very well, it practically died several times. But we brought it back to life by intervening as close as possible, and also because we didn't have an immediate deadline. The real deadline was KINDL September of 2016. So our production time ends in 2041, which means that this is when the studio abandons the project. If I'm alive by that time, of course, we will continue. But then it's actually in the hands of somebody else. And I see the work, even though it may seem for some people as a very complex piece of software, looking like a photoreal projection, blah blah blah. It's in fact something that many studios could pick up. And I imagine that by the time we come to 2041, this will be a piece of cake for young artists to keep on developing it. The problem will probably lie in, does anybody want to pick it up at that time? Is there a need for it? So my task is now to generate enough culture over the next decades to keep the work running, or not. And it's also, one I have to add, it's also being sold to collectors with that knowledge, is that it might come to an end, natural end. So obviously we started researching in archives, mainly online, archives on the Olympic Stadium. We tried to collaborate with a university, I forgot which university it was, but which maintained the archives of the renovation of the Olympic Stadium for the World Cup, which was really drastic changes happening underneath the stadium, but also above it. And from an artist studio, one cannot expect proper scientific research, especially not with my attention deficit disorder. But I have a few good people in the studio who actually do have this quality of researching. So in the end, we really did obtain the original plans and a sense of how fragile the building was constructed to begin with. It was done rather in a hurry, one could say. It was constructed over the period of about 3 years, because it had to be ready as a, well, some of you might know it was a propaganda stunt to show how good the Nazi Germany was to the outside world. And so in 3 years it was built, and but I always suspected that construction-wise it might not be very strong. It was because it was built as a piece of theater. It was built really as a place to convert people into a certain way of thinking. But while I did the research, I also realized that the Olympic Stadium is like techno music. It relies very much on repetition and rhythmical repetition in order to make you feel disoriented slightly. It has 180 columns around it which are pretty much identical, and you might lose your way when you come there for the first time. And it also has, the second thing I noticed was, or the third thing I noticed also was that it really had incorporated a certain religion of light. With the sun going up on the east and the building being entirely freestanding, at least in its inception. The trees were quite a bit smaller and there were no buildings around it. And light had, especially in summer, has a great play with the columns, north, south, east, west. Although they look similar, in fact, if you pay attention, there is a really, and I say this a little bit uncomfortable, but there's a really very deep beauty in the way the light is conceived and the way it plays around the building. I'm pretty sure that very little research has been done on the way the architects played with the passage of light through the seasons. And at one point I also noticed that at certain times of the year, the last rays of the sun really touch the athlete groups which are at the east side of the stadium. There's a set on the northern east side and there's a set on the southern east side. It comes back. Yeah, I'm helping myself out here with the computer, which is not mine. So forgive me if there's every now and then happening something that I don't want. And this is the plan. This is actually the very first sketches we made, orientation towards the sun. And I think this must be an early study of seasonal changes in light. Is that true? No. Never mind. I'll come to that later. Being trained essentially as a draftsman, as a lithographer, this is the way trainings go in Belgium, or at least they used to be. They were very academic, and I ended up as a skilled trainer, but as a very unhappy artist somehow. But I still draw. I don't paint anymore, but I still draw a lot. And these are some of my studies on Olympia. The drawings help me to gain confidence, and sometimes they don't really have a clear function in the whole process, but they help me get my mind together. Because as you may imagine, well, I'm actually a very impatient person, but we do work for many years on a single work sometimes, and it tends to get lost with all the different stages of production. A little bit like on a film set, and drawing helps getting the things back together. This is an acrylic study on the growing of weeds, and the two big challenges in the project technically are the guesstimates, one could say, of how the building will disintegrate by natural disintegration, so no bombs, no earthquakes, just climate and the seasons and the growth of weeds until they become trees and blah blah blah, and the trees ultimately will break up the building. But in order to know that, you need to go through a process of studying how the building is made, what is structurally underneath, what the foundations are, what is the concrete layer separating the earth from the surface, so how long will it take before weeds start to push through the stones and start to break up the stones. And I very early on, I will show you a few pictures, I realized that I had to use as an example a place which has now been abandoned for 25 years, well, 27 by now, which is Pripyat and Chernobyl in Ukraine. Because of very little human intervention. The problem there is that most of it is built with relatively bad quality concrete, which makes that nature rapidly gets a grip on the structure of the building and rips it apart very rapidly. In Olympia, and there is basically the revenge of the architects or the ideologists of the whole project of the building. is that they wanted good materials. And so they have this famous sandstone, of which I forgot the name now, which they dug out a lot also for Nuremberg. They dug out a lot, and which is this very beautiful but very strong, good quality stone. There is a concession to modernity in the sense that there is steel inside the structure, and the steel is a weak link. Steel, once water reaches it, of course will break up the whole building rather rapidly. But I have to say, there's much less concrete structure in the building than I initially expected. This is a simulation of snow, and we've had our first test with snow recently, of course, which was a bit of a nervous moment for us, because what would happen if it would snow in Berlin and in my work it wouldn't snow? Could one ever forgive me? And in fact, this picture is what started it all. I always carry a camera, and seeing this series of pictures, I realized that what I wanted to do was a sort of techno work. Hippie techno work, I would say. Hippo techno. I have to drink every now and then. It might help what was in the bottle, but so a hippie technological work in the sense that it would be a very precise and scientifically funded work, but that the whole pressure, the whole thing that pushed the thing forward was actually belief in nature alone and the power of nature alone. Of course, in gaming environments, which is the technology that I'm using to make the work, game engines and game architecture, eternity is really the last thing on the agenda. So I'm really fighting a little bit of a battle there with this software. And then these are the pictures that in fact gave me the idea what would happen if one would never touch these weeds. How would they grow? How would they accumulate? And there is one alleyway which is left untouched. If any of you have been there recently, you'll find that in the north part of the Olympic Stadium there's an alleyway next to the swimming pool, which I don't know if it's still today, but a few years ago it was not open for public. But you can see on the left side what happens when the weeds get a lot of sunlight. And you can see towards the shadow part to the right that they systematically, like in an army, they decrease size. And that's simply because they get less hours of sunlight. You know, that's the stuff that ideas are made of.